The sun had just begun its descent across the vast English countryside when Lord Nathaniel Blackwood, the infamous Duke of Thornfield, discovered the unconscious form of a young woman at the edge of his expansive estate. Her vibrant skirts spread around her like autumn leaves, her dark curls tangled with small silver coins that marked her unmistakably as Romani. The Duke, known throughout the county for his icy demeanor and reclusive nature since the death of his beloved wife 3 years prior, had been returning from a solitary ride when his horse nearly trampled the collapsed figure. Something in her vulnerable state pierced through his carefully constructed armor of indifference. With hands that had not offered kindness to a stranger in years, he knelt beside her, uncorked his water flask, and gently tipped the cool liquid between her parched lips. As consciousness returned to her eyes the color of forest moss after rain, the Duke found himself transfixed by a gaze that seemed to peer directly into the hollowed chambers of his heart. The simple act of offering water to Esmeralda Varga would have been scandalous enough in the eyes of proper society. But when Lord Blackwood, against every social convention he had been raised to uphold, lifted her onto his horse and brought her to Thornfield Manor for proper care, he set in motion events that would irrevocably alter the carefully ordered existence he had maintained since becoming a widower. The household staff watched in stunned silence as their master carried the Romani woman through the grand entrance hall, his voice cutting through their shock with commands for fresh water, bandages, and broth. Only Mrs. Winters, the stern-faced housekeeper who had served the Blackwood family for 3 decades, dared to voice opposition, her whispered warnings about gypsy thieves and family reputation falling on deaf ears as the Duke disappeared up the sweeping staircase with Esmeralda in his arms. Dawn broke with golden fingers, stretching across the dew-covered grounds of Thornfield Manor, illuminating a sight that sent Mrs. Winters into near apoplexy. Surrounding the eastern edge of the estate, a dozen brightly painted caravans had appeared overnight, their wooden wheels firmly planted in Blackwood soil, colored flags dancing in the morning breeze. Men in dark vests tended to horses, while women in layered skirts kindled breakfast fires, their presence a vivid interruption to the manicured perfection of the Duke's lands. From the highest window of the East Wing, Lord Nathaniel Blackwood observed the scene with growing fury. The brief moment of compassion he had shown now seeming like a grave error in judgment as he watched what appeared to be an invasion of his ancestral home. By the time Esmeralda had dressed and made her way to the manor's entrance hall, the Duke was already striding across his grounds, a battalion of groundskeepers and stable hands behind him, his face set in lines of cold authority that had earned him the whispered nickname the Winter Duke among the local villagers. Matteo Varga, patriarch of the Romani clan and Esmeralda's father, stood waiting, his weathered hands calmly clasped before him as the nobleman approached. The confrontation that followed was witnessed by dozens, servants peering from windows, Romani children watching wide-eyed from behind caravan wheels, and neighboring farmers who had hurried to the estate upon hearing of the unusual encampment. With each cutting word the Duke delivered, demanding immediate removal from his lands and threatening legal action, Esmeralda felt the familiar weight of prejudice settle upon her shoulders. The kindness she had glimpsed in his eyes as he offered her water had vanished, replaced by the same contempt she had encountered throughout her 22 years of life. Her clan had come only to express gratitude for her safe return and to offer the traditional blessing of good fortune to a household that had shown kindness to one of their own, a sacred obligation in Romani custom. Now they stood accused of trespassing and worse, with Lord Blackwood publicly declaring that his momentary charity had clearly been a mistake, his gaze deliberately avoiding Esmeralda's as he spoke the words that cut deeper than any physical wound could have. What neither the Duke nor the assembled onlookers could have known was that just beyond the manor's thick stone walls, 8-year-old Sebastian Blackwood lay burning with fever in his bedchamber, his small frame racked with the same mysterious illness that had claimed his mother's life years before. 3 physicians had already been summoned and departed, each leaving behind increasingly grim prognoses and useless tonics that did nothing to cool the boy's temperature or ease his labored breathing. It was this dire situation that had driven the Duke to his solitary ride the previous evening, an attempt to escape, if only for an hour, the suffocating fear that he would soon lose the only remaining light in his life. The confrontation with the Romani encampment now seemed a cruel addition to his burden, and as he delivered his final imperious command for their departure, the thunderous sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of Lord Edmund Whitmore, the Duke's neighbour and longtime rival, whose lands bordered Thornfield to the north. Lord Whitmore, a man whose ambition was matched only by his cruelty, wasted no time in announcing to all present that he would be petitioning the magistrate to have all Romani forcibly removed not just from Thornfield, but from the entire county. His thinly veiled threats of violence should they resist caused murmurs of approval among the Duke's staff, but ignited flashes of fear in the eyes of Esmeralda's people, who had faced such persecution before. It was then, with her chin held high and her voice steady despite her racing heart, that Esmeralda stepped forward. The words she spoke next were not about the injustice being done to her people, but rather carried news that stopped the Duke in his tracks. She had heard the servants speaking of his son's illness and recognized the symptoms from her extensive knowledge of herbal medicine. Her grandmother had been a renowned healer among both Romani and secretly desperate villagers who would seek help when conventional medicine failed. The transformation in the Duke's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Where moments before he had stood as an unmovable pillar of aristocratic disdain, he now turned to Esmeralda with the desperate eyes of a father willing to grasp at any hope, no matter how unconventional or socially unacceptable its source. Mrs. Winters protested vehemently when the Duke escorted Esmeralda back into the manor and up to Sebastian's sick room, her warnings about gypsy witchcraft echoing off the marble floors. Yet the Duke, who had adhered to society's rigid expectations his entire life, found himself beyond caring about propriety when faced with his son's shallow breathing and translucent skin. The next 3 days passed in a blur of tension and cautious hope, as Esmeralda worked tirelessly at Sebastian's bedside, applying poultices of herbs gathered from the woods surrounding Thornfield, brewing teas with ingredients from her own caravan, and singing soft Romani healing songs when she thought no one was listening. The Duke rarely left the room, watching with growing wonder as his son's fever gradually subsided under Esmeralda's care. He observed her gentle hands, so sure in their work despite her youth, and found himself drawn to the quiet dignity with which she bore the suspicious glares of the household staff. When Sebastian opened his eyes on the 3rd day and asked weakly for a story, the Duke felt something crack within his chest, a fissure in the ice that had encased his heart since Catherine's death. While Sebastian began his slow recovery, the Romani encampment remained on Thornfield land, their presence tolerated, if not welcomed by the Duke, who had privately instructed his groundskeepers to leave them be. Each evening, Esmeralda would return to her caravan, only to come back to the manor at dawn, her arms filled with fresh herbs and her eyes bright with determination to see her patient fully healed. It was during these quiet morning hours, when the household still slept and only the two of them kept vigil over Sebastian, that the Duke began to see beyond the prejudices he had been raised with and recognize the remarkable woman before him. Spring unfurled across the Thornfield estate with a gentleness that seemed to mirror Sebastian's gradual return to health. The boy who had once been too weak to lift his head now sat propped against pillows by the window, his thin face brightening whenever he spotted Esmeralda crossing the grounds from her caravan. For Sebastian, the young Romani woman had become something of an angel, a magical being who told him stories of distant lands and ancient wisdom while mixing foul-tasting medicines that somehow made him stronger. What the child could not fully comprehend was the growing tension that surrounded this arrangement. Each day more letters arrived from neighboring estates expressing concern over the Duke's gypsy problem, while whispers in the village market speculated wildly about enchantments and spells being cast over the vulnerable widower and his heir. Lord Whitmore had become particularly vocal in his criticism, hosting dinner parties where the primary entertainment consisted of mocking the Duke's apparent descent into madness by allowing vagrants and thieves to remain on his land. The Duke himself existed in a state of internal conflict that grew more pronounced with each passing day. His upbringing and position demanded that he distance himself from Esmeralda and her people now that Sebastian was recovering. Yet something deeper, a reluctant awakening within him, made such an action increasingly impossible to contemplate. He found himself lingering in rooms where Esmeralda worked, engaging her in conversations that began with Sebastian's treatment, but inevitably expanded to literature, philosophy, and the nature of the stars. Her intelligence astonished him. She had been taught to read by a sympathetic village priest during her childhood travels, and had devoured any book she could find thereafter. The vast Thornfield Library, previously a sanctuary of solitude for the Duke, became a shared space where he would sometimes find her tracing the spines of ancient volumes with reverent fingers, her expression one of such genuine wonder that it stirred long-dormant emotions within his chest. Mrs. Winters observed these developments with growing alarm, her loyalty to the Blackwood family manifesting as fierce protection of its reputation. One evening, as the Duke sat in his study reviewing estate accounts, she entered without knocking, an unprecedented breach of protocol that signaled the gravity of her concern. The conversation that followed was one the Duke would replay in his mind for weeks afterward. The housekeeper spoke of rumors reaching as far as London, of invitations to important social functions being rescinded, of Sebastian's future prospects being damaged beyond repair if the current situation continued. "A duke may admire a wild rose from afar," she had said with uncharacteristic bluntness, "but he cannot bring it into his garden without consequences." The word struck Nathaniel with particular force, for they echoed thoughts he had been fighting to suppress, thoughts of how the simple act of offering water to a thirsty woman had somehow led him to question the very foundations upon which his entire life had been constructed. That same night, unable to sleep and troubled by Mrs. Winters' warnings, the Duke found himself walking the moonlit grounds of his estate. Without conscious intention, his steps led him toward the Romani encampment, where a single fire still burned low. Seated beside it was Esmeralda, her fingers working deftly at some kind of embroidery, her profile illuminated by the golden light in a way that made Nathaniel's breath catch in his throat. He had intended to maintain his distance, to merely observe unseen from the shadows of an ancient oak, but something in her solitary posture, a quiet dignity mixed with an unmistakable melancholy, drew him forward against his better judgment. When she looked up and met his gaze, neither surprise nor deference crossed her features, only a calm acceptance, as if she had been expecting him all along. Their conversation began haltingly, the social chasm between them creating an awkwardness that had never before existed in their interactions within the structured setting of Sebastian's sick room. Yet as the fire crackled and night creatures called to one another from the surrounding woods, the Duke found himself speaking of things he had shared with no one since Catherine's death. His fear of failing his son, the crushing weight of maintaining the Blackwood legacy alone, the terrible isolation of his position. Esmeralda listened without judgment, her green eyes reflecting the flames as she shared in turn her own struggles, the prejudice her people faced at every turn, her thirst for knowledge in a world that offered her limited access to books, her responsibility to honor her family's traditions, while yearning for experiences beyond the constant travel of the Romani life. Dawn was approaching when the Duke finally rose to return to the manor, his conversation with Esmeralda having lasted through the night. As he turned to leave, she pressed something into his palm, a small sachet of dried herbs tied with red thread that she explained would help Sebastian sleep soundly and continue his healing. Their fingers touched briefly during this exchange, a momentary contact that sent an unexpected warmth through the Duke's entire body. He found himself unable to meet her gaze as he murmured his thanks, suddenly acutely aware of how improper their night-long conversation would appear to anyone who might have witnessed it. Yet as he walked back through the dew-covered fields, the small sachet clutched in his hand, Nathaniel realized he felt lighter than he had in years, as if some invisible burden had begun to shift from his shoulders during those hours of honest conversation beneath the stars. The fragile peace that had settled over Thornfield was shattered 1 week later, when Sebastian, now strong enough for short walks outdoors, was discovered missing from his room. Panic erupted throughout the manor as servants searched every corner, calling the boy's name with increasing desperation. The Duke, white-faced with fear, led the search himself, memories of losing Catherine now compounded by the terror of losing their son. It was Mrs. Winters who finally spotted Sebastian's small figure at the edge of the Romani camp. sitting cross-legged before Matteo Varga, as the older man demonstrated how to carve a small wooden whistle. The sight of his heir, the future Duke of Thornfield, happily engaged in such common company, sent a complex wave of emotions through Nathaniel. Relief at finding Sebastian safe, anger at the boy's disobedience, and a strange, unexpected jealousy that his son seemed so comfortable among Esmeralda's people, when he had been so withdrawn and silent with his own father since his mother's death. The confrontation that followed became the talk of the household for days afterward. The Duke, still shaking with the aftermath of fear, had marched into the camp and seized Sebastian's arm, dragging the protesting child away while delivering a scathing condemnation of the Romani for encouraging his son to wander from safety. Esmeralda had intervened, her normally calm demeanor giving way to fierce protection as she reminded the Duke that Sebastian had come of his own accord and had been treated with nothing but kindness. "You fear us because you do not understand us," she had declared, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent camp. "But your son sees with clearer eyes than you do, Your Grace." The words delivered with such quiet conviction had stopped the Duke in his tracks. Sebastian, tears streaming down his face, had broken free from his father's grip to throw his arms around Esmeralda's waist, crying that she was the only one who didn't treat him like he was made of glass, the only one who told him the truth instead of whispers behind closed doors. That evening, locked in his study with a glass of brandy that did nothing to calm his troubled thoughts, the Duke was forced to confront the truth in Esmeralda's words. He had kept Sebastian wrapped in layers of protection since Catherine's death, treating the boy as a precious relic of his lost wife rather than a living, growing child with needs beyond physical care. The realization was a painful one, cutting through years of grief-induced blindness with merciless clarity. When a soft knock interrupted his brooding, he opened the door to find Sebastian in his nightshirt, small face solemn as he held out a crudely carved wooden whistle, Matteo's gift that he had managed to keep despite the afternoon's drama. "I made music, Papa," the boy said simply, demonstrating with a shrill blast that made the Duke wince even as his heart contracted with an emotion too complex to name. "Esmeralda says Mama can hear it, even though she's with the angels now." The conversation that followed between father and son lasted well into the night, the first real communication they had shared since Catherine's funeral. Sebastian spoke of his memories of his mother, of his fears during his illness, and of how Esmeralda had promised him stories of brave Romani children if he fought hard against the fever. The Duke listened with growing wonder as his son's personality emerged from behind the veil of illness and grief, revealing a thoughtful, curious child who had been silently observing far more than anyone had realized. When Sebastian finally fell asleep in his father's arms, exhausted from emotional release, the Duke carried him to bed with a newfound tenderness. Standing in the doorway of his son's room, watching the rise and fall of the small chest that had so recently struggled for each breath, Nathaniel made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. Tomorrow he would speak to Esmeralda about remaining at Thornfield permanently as Sebastian's tutor and companion. Society's opinions be damned. The following morning brought unexpected visitors to Thornfield. The Duke, who had risen early with the intention of seeking out Esmeralda, instead found himself greeting the local magistrate and 2 constables in his entrance hall. Lord Whitmore stood smugly behind them, his thin lips curved in a smile that did not reach his cold eyes. The purpose of their visit became immediately clear. Formal complaints had been filed regarding the illegal encampment on Thornfield lands, with additional allegations that the Romani woman attending to the young heir was practicing witchcraft and endangering the child. The magistrate, a nervous man clearly uncomfortable with confronting a duke in his own home, but equally fearful of defying the collective will of the other local nobility, presented a document ordering the immediate removal of all Romani from the county, with specific mention of Esmeralda Varga, as a person of dangerous influence who was to be escorted to the county borders by sundown. Fury, unlike anything Nathaniel had experienced since his wife's death, coursed through him as he listened to these accusations, particularly when Lord Whitmore stepped forward to suggest with false concern that perhaps the Duke himself was under some enchantment given his uncharacteristic tolerance of the gypsies. It took every ounce of the self-control that had been ingrained in him since birth not to physically remove the man from his home. Instead, the Duke drew himself up to his full height, his voice taking on the glacial authority that had once made lesser men tremble in London's highest social circles. He informed the magistrate that Sebastian Blackwood had been at death's door until Esmeralda's intervention succeeded, where 3 qualified physicians had failed. Furthermore, he declared that as Duke of Thornfield, he had full authority to allow whomever he chose to reside on his extensive lands, and any attempt to forcibly remove his guests would constitute trespassing and would be dealt with accordingly. The confrontation might have ended there, with the magistrate clearly inclined to retreat in the face of ducal displeasure, had Sebastian not chosen that moment to appear at the top of the grand staircase, calling out for Esmeralda. The boy's innocent question, whether she would take him to see the new foals as promised, provided Lord Whitmore the perfect ammunition. With exaggerated horror, he pointed to this as evidence of the unnatural influence being exerted over the Blackwood heir, suggesting that the boy's very inheritance might be at risk from these cunning interlopers. When Sebastian, confused by the tension, began to descend the stairs to defend his friend, the Duke made a split-second decision that would have far-reaching consequences. Rather than allowing his son to become further embroiled in the ugly scene, Nathaniel turned to the magistrate and agreed to a compromise. The Romani camp would relocate, but Esmeralda would remain at Thornfield under his personal protection as Sebastian's nurse until the boy was fully recovered. The terms satisfied no one completely. The magistrate was reluctant to defy the Duke outright. Lord Whitmore was furious that Esmeralda would remain, and Nathaniel himself felt the bitter taste of cowardice for not defending all of Esmeralda's people with equal vigor. When the officials finally departed, the Duke wasted no time in sending for Matteo Varga to explain the situation. The Romani patriarch listened in stoic silence, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts, until Nathaniel had finished speaking. "My daughter has a gift for healing," Matteo finally said, his accented English measured and dignified. "But she also has the gift of seeing true hearts. If she chooses to remain here while we travel on, it will be her decision alone." The older man's piercing gaze seemed to evaluate the Duke's worth as he added, "She has never before wished to stay in one place. Perhaps she too is healing something here." The conversation with Esmeralda herself proved far more difficult. When informed of the arrangement, her green eyes flashed with an indignation that transformed her entire countenance. "So you would have me stay while my family is driven away?" she demanded, pacing the library where the Duke had requested their meeting. "You stand against Lord Whitmore's order for me, but accept it for my people." Her words struck Nathaniel like physical blows, for they exposed the fundamental weakness in his position. He had indeed compromised, protecting what mattered most to him personally, while allowing the broader injustice to continue. Yet as he struggled to explain his reasoning, mentioning Sebastian's attachment to her and the boy's continued need for her care, something in Esmeralda's expression shifted. Behind her anger, the Duke glimpsed a flicker of understanding, perhaps even compassion for his impossible position. "I will stay for Sebastian," she finally said, her voice softer but still edged with disappointment. "But not in hiding, Your Grace. If I am to remain at Thornfield, it will be with my head held high, not as some secret to be ashamed of." The terms of her acceptance left the Duke both relieved and disquieted, aware that keeping Esmeralda at Thornfield would require him to take a public stance that would forever alter his standing in society. The days following the departure of the Romani caravan marked the beginning of a subtle but profound transformation at Thornfield. With Esmeralda now officially installed as Sebastian's companion and tutor, the Duke found himself navigating uncharted territory both within his household and in his interactions with the outside world. Mrs. Winters, though she had maintained a rigid disapproval of the arrangement, was too professional to directly challenge her employer's decision. Instead, her resistance took the form of small, pointed gestures. Esmeralda's meals served cold, her requests for additional books for Sebastian's lessons mysteriously delayed, her presence pointedly ignored during household meetings. The other servants took their cue from the housekeeper, treating the Romani woman with a chilly politeness that bordered on insolence. Yet Esmeralda bore these daily slights with remarkable dignity, focusing her attention entirely on Sebastian's education and continuing recovery, introducing the boy to knowledge that went far beyond the traditional classical education he would have received from a conventional tutor. The first real test of the Duke's resolve came 3 weeks after the magistrate's visit, when an invitation arrived for the midsummer ball at Whitmore Hall. Such events were the cornerstone of county society, attended by every family of note within 50 miles, and the Duke's absence would be not merely noticed, but dissected in exhaustive detail by the local gentry. The invitation was pointedly addressed to His Grace the Duke of Thornfield and his son Sebastian Blackwood, with no mention of a companion or attendant for the boy. The implication was clear: Esmeralda was not welcome. Under normal circumstances, the Duke would have attended such a function out of obligation rather than desire, maintaining the social connections necessary for Sebastian's future prospects. Now he found himself torn between upholding his position in society and honoring his growing conviction that Esmeralda deserved better treatment than she had received from his peers. The decision was unexpectedly made for him when Sebastian fell ill again, not with a recurrence of his previous dangerous fever, but with a simple summer cold that nonetheless sent terror through the Duke's heart. The memory of losing Catherine to what had initially seemed a minor ailment made Nathaniel irrationally fearful, and he refused to leave his son's side, even as Esmeralda assured him that the boy would recover within days. As Sebastian dozed fitfully in his chamber, the Duke and Esmeralda maintained a shared vigil, their conversation gradually deepening into territories Nathaniel had never expected to explore with anyone, let alone a woman from a background so different from his own. In the quiet intimacy of the sick room, with Sebastian's breathing as a gentle backdrop, the Duke found himself confessing the true depth of his grief over Catherine, not just the loss of his wife, but the suffocating weight of guilt he carried for having been unable to save her. "I was here in this very room watching her fade hour by hour," he told Esmeralda, his voice barely above a whisper as he gazed at his sleeping son. "The most powerful man in the county, with all my wealth and position, and I could do nothing but hold her hand as she slipped away." The admission, never before shared with anyone, seemed to drain something poisonous from his spirit, a release made possible only by the compassion in Esmeralda's eyes, free from the pitying condescension he had seen in others. Her response came after a long moment of respectful silence, her words carrying the weight of someone who had faced her own losses with clear-eyed acceptance. "Death is not a failure, Your Grace," she said softly. "It is simply the other side of the door we all must pass through eventually. Your wife's journey was earlier than you wished, but loving someone does not mean we can change their path, only walk beside them for as long as we are permitted." In that moment, something shifted irrevocably between them, a recognition of kindred spirits, despite the vast differences in their worlds. The morning of the midsummer ball arrived with Sebastian much improved, but still weak, providing the Duke with the perfect excuse to send his regrets to Lord Whitmore. What Nathaniel had not anticipated was the response his absence would provoke. By evening, as he sat reading aloud to Sebastian with Esmeralda working on embroidery nearby, a scene of domestic tranquility that had become increasingly common, a messenger arrived from Whitmore Hall with an envelope bearing the seal of not just Lord Whitmore, but 5 other prominent families of the county. The message inside was brief but devastating, a formal notice that due to the Duke's continued association with undesirable elements and his neglect of proper society, a petition was being prepared to request that the Crown appoint a guardian for Sebastian, citing concerns about the heir's upbringing and moral education. The thinly veiled threat struck at the Duke's greatest vulnerability, his son's welfare and future, and was clearly designed to force him to choose between Sebastian's security and his growing attachment to Esmeralda. The Duke's reaction to the threat was not what anyone at Thornfield might have expected. Rather than retreating or capitulating to the pressure, something hardened within him, a resolve born of the accumulated injuries society had inflicted not just on Esmeralda, but on his own capacity for genuine connection since Catherine's death. After a night of solitary contemplation in his study, Nathaniel emerged with a plan so audacious that Mrs. Winters nearly dropped the breakfast tray when he outlined it to her the following morning. The Duke of Thornfield would host a grand summer gala, inviting every notable family in the county, along with key members of London society, whose influence far outweighed that of Lord Whitmore and his provincial allies. The date was set for 2 weeks hence, allowing just enough time for invitations to be dispatched and preparations to be made, but not so much time that rumours of the Duke's supposed mismanagement of his heir could spread to the capital. The housekeeper, despite her misgivings about Esmeralda's presence, could not help but be energized by the prospect of Thornfield Manor returning to its former glory as a social centre, and she threw herself into the preparations with unexpected enthusiasm. Esmeralda, when informed of the Duke's intention to present her formally to society at this gathering, responded with a complex mix of emotions that played across her expressive features. "So you need not risk your position for me," she told him, as they walked the grounds together, Sebastian running ahead of them in pursuit of a butterfly. "My people have always lived on society's edges. We do not expect to be welcomed at its centre." The Duke, watching his son's carefree movements, a joy that had been absent for so long, felt a surety that had been growing within him for weeks finally crystallize into unshakable conviction. "It is not merely for you," he replied, his voice low but firm. "It is for Sebastian, who deserves to see courage rather than cowardice from his father. It is for myself, to break free from constraints that have brought me nothing but isolation. And yes, it is for you, because you have shown more dignity in the face of contempt than those who claim superior breeding." The hand he offered her then was steady, an invitation not just to the upcoming gala, but to a future neither of them could fully envision, yet both increasingly desired. The preparations for the gala transformed Thornfield Manor from a house of mourning to one humming with renewed purpose. Invitations written in the Duke's own hand were dispatched by his fastest riders. Marble floors that had dulled with neglect were polished to a mirror shine, gardens that had grown somewhat wild were tamed into formal elegance, and chambers that had remained closed since Catherine's death were open to air in anticipation of overnight guests from London. Through it all, Sebastian thrived, his natural curiosity engaged by the flurry of activity, and his spirits lifted by the evident happiness that had begun to animate his father's previously solemn features. Esmeralda, though she maintained a cautious reserve about the upcoming event, contributed in ways that subtly transformed the preparations, suggesting the inclusion of wild summer flowers alongside the cultivated roses, teaching the kitchen staff Romani spice combinations that elevated traditional English dishes to unexpected heights, and helping Sebastian prepare a special musical performance that would showcase his recovery to the assembled Guwe. Stees. As acceptance letters began arriving from London, including several from influential figures whose attendance would effectively neutralize any attempt by Lord Whitmore to damage the Duke's reputation, Nathaniel found himself seized by an unexpected concern. The evening before the first guests were due to arrive, he sought out Esmeralda in the library, where she sat reading by lamplight, her dark curls cascading over the simple blue dress that was far removed from the elaborate gowns the female guests would wear. The question that had been troubling him emerged awkwardly, revealing a vulnerability that surprised them both. "Will you be comfortable, dressed as, that is, the ladies will be wearing—" He gestured vaguely at her attire, unable to complete the thought without sounding superficial. Esmeralda's soft laugh held no offense as she marked her place in the book and rose to face him. "You are wondering if the gypsy woman will embarrass you with her colorful rags," she teased, though her eyes remained kind. Before he could protest, she continued more seriously. "My mother was lady's maid to a countess in Prague before she met my father. I know how your world dresses for such occasions, and yes, your grace, I have something suitable." The morning of the gala brought a flurry of arrivals to Thornfield, with carriages rolling up the long drive at regular intervals throughout the day. The Duke greeted each guest personally, Sebastian at his side, both Blackwood men attired in formal elegance that reflected their station. The initial reactions to the boy's obvious good health helped set a positive tone, with many expressing genuine pleasure at seeing the heir so robust after rumors of his precarious condition had circulated. Nathaniel had deliberately delayed any mention of Esmeralda, allowing his guests to settle in and observe the orderly, prosperous state of his household before introducing the element that had caused such controversy. As afternoon faded into early evening, and guests began to gather in the grand ballroom for the formal commencement of the gala, the Duke excused himself to meet Esmeralda as planned at the foot of the main staircase. What he saw when he rounded the corner stole the breath from his lungs. Standing in a pool of dying sunlight streaming through the high windows was not the Esmeralda he had come to know, dressed in practical simplicity, but a vision that bridged worlds in a way he had not thought possible. Esmeralda wore a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light with each subtle movement, its cut following the fashionable lines of the day while incorporating elements that honored her heritage. Small silver coins sewn into the hem caught the light like stars, while embroidery and patterns unique to her people adorned the bodice, telling a story only those versed in Romani symbols could read. Her dark hair was arranged in an elegant style that nonetheless allowed some curls to frame her face naturally, and at her throat rested a single pendant of amber, a protective talisman passed through generations of Varga women. She wore no cosmetics as the fashionable ladies did, her natural coloring providing all the contrast needed against the rich fabric of her gown. The effect was transformative without being a transformation. She remained unmistakably herself, proud, dignified, and authentic, while demonstrating her ability to move between worlds without compromising her identity. The Duke, momentarily speechless, finally managed a formal bow that conveyed more genuine respect than he had shown to any duchess or countess arriving that day. "Thornfield has never welcomed a more beautiful guest," he said quietly, offering his arm. The smile she gave him in return held both vulnerability and determination as she placed her hand on his sleeve, ready to face whatever reception awaited them in the ballroom. Their entrance created exactly the sensation the Duke had anticipated, a wave of silence that swept across the room as conversations halted mid-sentence, followed by a rising murmur of speculation as guests leaned toward one another behind gloved hands and raised fans. Lord Whitmore, positioned near the orchestra with a group of local allies, made no attempt to disguise his outrage, his face flushing an unbecoming shade as he observed the Duke's public endorsement of the woman he had worked so diligently to remove from the county. Yet before any open confrontation could materialize, Nathaniel guided Esmeralda directly to where the most influential of his London guests stood, Lady Harrington, whose husband served as advisor to the Crown on matters of rural governance, and whose social approval could make or break reputations far greater than Lord Whitmore's. With perfect aristocratic poise, the Duke made the introduction. "Lady Harrington, may I present Miss Esmeralda Varga, to whom I owe the life of my son and heir." The calculated reference to Sebastian's recovery was deliberate, placing Esmeralda's presence in a context that even the most conventional society matron would find difficult to criticize openly. Lady Harrington, a formidable woman whose seemingly benign exterior masked a razor-sharp intelligence and a distaste for provincial pettiness, assessed Esmeralda with a thoroughness that might have intimidated a less composed individual. After a moment that stretched uncomfortably for those watching, she extended her hand with genuine warmth. "My dear, I understand you have knowledge of herbal medicine that puts our London physicians to shame. I should very much like to discuss your methods over tea tomorrow. My rheumatism has been quite troublesome this season." The exchange, witnessed by dozens, effectively established the tone for the evening. If Lady Harrington accepted Esmeralda, others would follow suit regardless of private reservations. The Duke, feeling the first tension begin to ease from his shoulders, guided Esmeralda through a series of similar introductions, each carefully chosen to build a foundation of acceptance among those whose opinions carried weight beyond the borders of the county. As the orchestra began the first dance of the evening, the assembled company waited with barely concealed curiosity to see if the Duke would commit the final social transgression of dancing with the Romani woman he had brought into their midst. Nathaniel, acutely aware of the scrutiny but past the point of allowing it to dictate his actions, turned to Esmeralda with a formal bow. "Would you honor me with this dance, Miss Varga?" The question, asked at a volume intended to carry to nearby guests, contained a wealth of meaning beyond the simple request. Esmeralda's eyes, meeting his with an openness that had become precious to him, reflected complete understanding of what this public acknowledgement would mean. Her curtsy in response was graceful, neither exaggerated to mock the customs of his world, nor hesitant from uncertainty in her movements. "The honor would be mine, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes fixed upon them as he led her to the center of the ballroom. The dance that followed became the moment that would be recounted in drawing rooms and servants' halls alike for months afterward. The Duke of Thornfield, known for his rigid adherence to propriety before his wife's death and for his reclusive grief afterward, moved across the floor with fluid grace, his eyes never leaving the face of the Romani woman whose hand rested in his. For her part, Esmeralda danced with a natural elegance that belied any notion that she might be uncomfortable in such surroundings. The other couples who gradually joined them on the floor maintained a noticeable distance, as if uncertain whether proximity might somehow taint them by association, but the isolation only served to highlight the tableau the Duke and Esmeralda created, a visual representation of worlds bridged and barriers challenged. When the music ended, and Nathaniel returned Esmeralda to the edge of the floor, the murmurs had grown louder, no longer contained behind fans and gloves, but openly exchanged between guests whose shock had evolved into fascinated speculation. The most observant among them, including Lady Harrington, whose approval would influence many, had noticed something beyond the social impropriety. The transformation in the Duke himself, whose features had lost the frozen quality of grief that had characterized him for years, replaced by something that looked remarkably like happiness. The evening progressed with an undercurrent of tension that seemed to energize rather than diminish the festivities. Guests who had arrived expecting a somber affair befitting the Duke's reputation found themselves swept into an atmosphere of unexpected vitality. Sebastian's planned performance, a folk melody Esmeralda had taught him, played on the piano with surprising skill for a child recently so ill, drew genuine applause, the boy's obvious happiness creating a stark contrast to Lord Whitmore's increasingly sour expression as he observed his campaign of social isolation crumbling before his eyes. The supper that followed featured dishes subtly influenced by Romani flavors, exotic enough to intrigue the London guests while remaining familiar enough not to alarm country palates. Throughout it all, the Duke maintained a careful balance, attentive to all his guests while making it clear through 100 small gestures that Esmeralda held a place of special significance at Thornfield. By the time the older guests began to retire and the younger ones gathered for more dancing, a new narrative had taken hold among the influential visitors from London. The tragic Duke had found not just healing for his son, but perhaps a renewal for himself through the unconventional connection with the remarkable Romani woman. Lord Whitmore, watching his carefully constructed plan disintegrate as Esmeralda was increasingly treated with genuine interest rather than polite tolerance, finally made his move as the evening neared its conclusion. Approaching the Duke as Nathaniel stood conversing with a small group that included Lady Harrington, Whitmore's voice carried with deliberate volume across the now quieter ballroom. A charming entertainment, Thornfield, though rather exotic for country tastes. One wonders what dear Catherine would think of her replacement being selected from a roadside camp. The calculated cruelty of the reference to the Duke's deceased wife created an immediate bubble of shocked silence around them. Lady Harrington's fan snapped closed with an audible click, her expression shifting from enjoyment to glacial disapproval, not at the Duke, but at Whitmore's breach of the most basic social propriety in mentioning the dead in such a manner. Before Nathaniel could respond, however, it was Esmeralda who stepped forward, her composure unshaken, even as her eyes flashed with a defensive fire on the Duke's behalf. "How fortunate Lady Catherine must have been," she said, her voice clear and carrying just as Whitmore's had, though with none of his malicious undertone, to have inspired such lasting devotion in her husband that even years after her passing, her memory is still being used as a shield against happiness by those who claim to have been her friends. The subtle repositioning was masterful, casting Whitmore not as the defender of Catherine's memory, but as someone exploiting it for his own purposes, while simultaneously acknowledging the depth of the Duke's grief without diminishing it. The murmurs that followed held a new note of appreciation for her quick wit and emotional intelligence, qualities valued in aristocratic circles regardless of their source. Lord Whitmore, suddenly aware that he had miscalculated his audience, attempted to recover with a dismissive laugh. Clever words from a clever gypsy. One might almost believe she's been educated rather than merely learning to mimic her betters. What happened next would be described with varying degrees of accuracy, depending on which guest recounted it later, but all versions agreed on the essential facts. The Duke of Thornfield, a man known for his rigid self-control even before grief had frozen his public persona entirely, stepped forward with such sudden purpose that Lord Whitmore instinctively retreated a half-step. "You will apologize to Miss Varga immediately," Nathaniel said, his voice so quiet that guests strained to hear, yet so charged with authority that the command was unmistakable. When Whitmore attempted to deflect with a half-smile and a glance around for support, finding none even among his local allies who recognized the shifting tide of influence, the Duke continued with measured precision. "Miss Varga saved my son's life when your recommended physicians had abandoned hope. She has shown more genuine nobility in her actions than I have witnessed in a lifetime of moving among those who claim the title by birth. And she has done all this while enduring prejudice that would have broken a lesser spirit." The Duke paused, his gaze sweeping the assembled company before returning to Whitmore. "I invited you into my home tonight, despite your attempts to separate me from my son through your petition. I did so because I believed even you might be capable of growth when presented with truth. It appears I was mistaken." The collective intake of breath that followed this revelation, that Whitmore had attempted to have Sebastian removed from his father's custody, created the final shift in the evening's dynamics. Lady Harrington, whose husband's influence could single-handedly quash any such petition regardless of local support, fixed Whitmore with a stare that promised consequences far beyond this single embarrassing moment. Other London guests, whose connections to the Crown and Parliament far outweighed provincial opinions, moved subtly away from Whitmore and toward the Duke, their allegiance declared through proximity rather than words. Faced with complete social defeat, Whitmore attempted a recovery through attack, his voice rising with barely controlled rage. "You would destroy centuries of Blackwood dignity for a gypsy witch? Your father would disown you for this madness." The desperation in the accusation revealed the depths of his miscalculation, for in attacking the Duke's feelings for Esmeralda so directly, he had forced Nathaniel to either defend those feelings openly or concede through silence, and the Duke of Thornfield had moved far beyond the point of concession. "My father," Nathaniel replied with a calm that belied the emotion visible in his eyes, "taught me that the true measure of nobility lies not in whom we exclude, but in whom we are willing to protect at cost to ourselves." He turned to Esmeralda then, taking her hand in a gesture visible to every guest remaining in the ballroom. "Miss Varga has taught me that courage comes in many forms, some quieter but no less powerful than others. She has reminded me that life continues even after devastating loss, not as a betrayal of what came before, but as an affirmation of it." The words, though addressed to Whitmore, were clearly meant for Esmeralda herself, whose composed expression softened into something so intimate that many guests glanced away, suddenly feeling like intruders witnessing a private moment. The Duke's final statement, delivered with the weight of absolute conviction, effectively ended both the confrontation and any question of where Thornfield's future path would lead. "I would consider it the greatest honor of my life if Miss Varga would consent to become the Duchess of Thornfield, bringing her wisdom, compassion, and strength to both my son's life and my own." Summer gave way to autumn, in a flurry of unprecedented activity at Thornfield Manor. The Duke's public proposal to Esmeralda at the gala had created precisely the scandal Lord Whitmore had hoped for, but with consequences entirely opposite to his expectations. Rather than isolating the Duke, the dramatic declaration had sparked fascination among the London elite, who found the romantic narrative of the grieving nobleman saved by the beautiful Romani healer irresistibly compelling. Invitations flooded Thornfield from hostesses, eager to present the unusual couple at their gatherings, while the local gentry, sensing which way the social winds were blowing, quickly adjusted their positions to support the match they had previously condemned. Lord Whitmore, finding himself suddenly unwelcome in the very circles where he had once held sway, retreated to his estate in bitter defeat, his petition regarding Sebastian's guardianship quietly buried beneath the weight of Lady Harrington's influence. Through it all, the Duke and Esmeralda moved with a steady purpose, neither flaunting their unconventional relationship nor hiding it from public view, their focus remaining on Sebastian's continued well-being and the practical matters of uniting two vastly different worlds. The wedding itself, held as October painted Thornfield's extensive grounds in russet and gold, reflected the bridge being built between those worlds. In the chapel where generations of Blackwoods had exchanged vows, traditional English ceremony blended with Romani customs in a celebration unlike any the county had witnessed. Sebastian, resplendent in formal attire, yet wearing a small red cord tied around his wrist, a Romani symbol of protection Matteo had given him, stood proudly beside his father as Esmeralda entered. Her gown combined the silhouette expected of a duchess-to-be with embroidery, telling the story of her journey from the camp to the manor, silver coins still adorning the hem to symbolize prosperity. Matteo walked his daughter down the aisle with dignified pride. Having returned with the caravan upon receiving the Duke's personal invitation, the patriarch's initial skepticism gradually replaced by cautious approval as he observed the genuine respect with which Nathaniel treated both Esmeralda and her heritage. The congregation itself told the story of transformation. Aristocrats from London seated alongside Romani family members, the Varga clan's vibrant attire creating a striking contrast to formal English morning dress. Yet all united in witnessing a union that many had once deemed impossible. The months that followed brought changes to Thornfield that extended far beyond the personal happiness of the new Duchess and her family. With Esmeralda's influence, the Duke established a school on the estate open to all local children, regardless of background, including those from Romani families passing through the region. The infirmary where Sebastian had recovered was expanded into a proper clinic where Esmeralda shared her knowledge of herbal medicine, with conventional physicians willing to learn, creating treatments that combined the best of both approaches. Land at the edge of the estate was designated as a permanent welcome ground for traveling Romani, ensuring that Esmeralda's people would always have safe harbor in a county that had once sought to expel them. These initiatives, initially viewed with suspicion by some locals, gradually earned respect as their benefits became apparent, with Lady Harrington's enthusiastic patronage helping to transform what might have remained controversial into something approaching fashionable enlightenment among the progressive members of society. Within the manor itself, the most profound changes were the quietest ones. Sebastian, flourishing under the joint guidance of his father and new mother, grew from a fragile child into a confident boy whose education encompassed both the classical requirements of his future position and the practical wisdom of Romani tradition. The Duke, once known for his remote dignity, learned to laugh again, his natural reserve softening without diminishing the core strength that had seen him through his darkest days. And Esmeralda, who had never expected to find a permanent home, let alone one of such privilege, brought to her role as Duchess the same authentic spirit that had first drawn Nathaniel to her, never attempting to erase her origins, but instead enriching the Blackwood legacy with traditions that would continue long after they were gone. On winter evenings, when the family gathered in the library that had once been the Duke's solitary refuge, Thornfield resonated with stories in two languages, music from different traditions blending into something new and yet timeless. The tale of how the Duke offered water to a thirsty Romani girl, only to find his life transformed when her caravan surrounded his manor the following morning, eventually passed into local legend. Some versions emphasized the romance, others the scandal, but all recognized the fundamental truth at its core, that sometimes the most profound journeys begin with the simplest acts of human kindness, and that true nobility has little to do with birth and everything to do with the courage to recognize value where others see only difference. For you, dear listener, perhaps there is a lesson here worth carrying into your own life. In a world that so often encourages us to build walls between ourselves and those who seem different, remember that a single moment of compassion, like offering water to a thirsty stranger, might open doors to possibilities you never imagined. The paths that most transform us rarely appear significant when we first step upon them. It is only in looking back that we recognize the moment everything changed. So perhaps today, extend your hand where you might ordinarily withdraw it, speak kindly where you might remain silent, or welcome someone society has taught you to fear. For as the Duke of Thornfield discovered, our greatest happiness often lies just beyond the boundaries of what we have been taught is possible.